She left with my best friend. 2 years later, she knocked on my door. The night I found out, I finished my drink first. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of bourbon I'd poured 20 minutes earlier, and I'd just read the message on Sarah's phone. A message she'd left unlocked on the counter while she was in the shower, which I will spend the rest of my life believing was not an accident. I read it once. I set the phone down exactly where she'd left it. I picked up my glass and I finished my drink. Then I sat there in the quiet of a house I'd spent 4 years building a life inside, and I thought about the two people who had just burned it down, and I made myself a promise. I was not going to give either of them the satisfaction of watching me break. That was 2 years ago. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 43 years old. I'm a structural engineer based in Nashville, Tennessee. And the story of how my wife and my best friend tried to take my future, and why they were already too late when they tried, starts long before that night at the kitchen table. It starts with a handshake in a parking lot 12 years ago, between two men who thought they were building something together. I met Daniel Marsh my first week at Kellerman and Associates, the engineering firm where I'd just taken a senior position after 7 years in Atlanta. He was already a partner. 3 years ahead of me, sharp, the kind of man who remembered every detail of every conversation and used it with precision. We were assigned to the same infrastructure project, a bridge rehabilitation contract outside Murfreesboro, and we spent 6 weeks driving out there together at 6 in the morning, arguing about load distribution and coming back arguing about everything else. By the end of the project, we were friends, real ones. The kind that take years to build and that you don't question once they exist. 4 years later, we left Kellerman together and started Cole and Marsh Structural, a boutique firm, just the two of us and a small team, focused on commercial and municipal contracts in the Southeast. We put equal money in, split everything down the middle, and shook hands in a parking lot outside the bank where we'd just signed the paperwork. We're either going to get rich or hate each other, Daniel said. Maybe both, I said. He laughed. We went to dinner. It was the best decision I'd made in my professional life. I met Sarah 9 months after the firm opened. She was a landscape architect, sharp and creative, with opinions about everything and the confidence to defend them. She and Daniel had overlapped professionally on a project years before I met her, which she mentioned once in passing, and which I filed away without thinking much about it. We were married 2 years later. Daniel was my best man. For 5 years, everything held. The firm was growing. We'd landed 2 significant municipal contracts and a commercial development in Brentwood that put us on the map in Nashville. Sarah's practice was doing well. We'd bought a house in East Nashville and spent 2 years renovating it together. Life had the particular texture of something built carefully, and I was proud of it. Then I read that message. I won't quote it in full because the words don't matter. What matters is that it was unambiguous. It was not new, and it was written in the casual shorthand of 2 people who had long since stopped being careful. I set the phone down. I finished my drink. When Sarah came out of the shower 20 minutes later, I was in the living room with the television on. She said something about dinner. I said something back. She sat on the other end of the couch and we watched an hour of something I couldn't tell you the name of, and then I told her I was tired and went to bed. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark, and I did the thing my father had taught me to do when something went wrong that you couldn't immediately fix. I listed what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I needed to find out. My father was a civil engineer who had spent 40 years solving problems that looked unsolvable, and he had the same approach to everything: personal, professional, structural. You can't fix what you haven't measured, he used to say. So measure first. What I knew, Sarah and Daniel had been involved. The message indicated duration, months at minimum, possibly longer. They had been careful enough that I hadn't seen it, which meant it was deliberate. What I didn't know, how long exactly. whether anyone else knew, what the implications were for the firm. That last one was the one that kept me awake. Cole and Marsh Structural was a 50-50 partnership. Our operating agreement, which Daniel and I had drafted with a lawyer 8 years ago, contained a buyout clause that we'd written as a formality, a mechanism for one partner to exit if the other triggered it, priced at a formula based on trailing revenue. We'd written it assuming we'd never use it. I lay there in the dark and I thought about that clause for a long time. By 3 a.m, I knew what I needed to do. I just needed to know how much time I had to do it. The next morning I called my lawyer. Her name was Margaret Osey, no relation to any Patricia, just a woman in her 50s who ran a small practice in Germantown and who had handled my personal legal work for 6 years with the kind of discretion I'd come to rely on. I called her at 8 a.m. and told her I needed to review our partnership agreement and specifically the buyout provisions. I told her it was time sensitive. She said to come in that afternoon. I went to work first. Daniel was already in the office when I arrived, standing at the coffee machine, already talking about a site visit we had scheduled for Thursday, already moving through the day the way he always did, with the particular efficiency of someone who didn't carry much weight. I watched him for a moment from the doorway. I said good morning. I poured my coffee. We talked about the site visit. I am still to this day proud of that morning. Margaret reviewed the operating agreement over 2 hours that afternoon. She read it carefully, made notes, read certain sections twice. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me. The buyout clause is clean, she said. If you trigger it, he gets the formula price and 30 days to respond. He can counter, but if he doesn't, the buyout proceeds automatically. What's the formula price based on current numbers? She named a figure. It was below what Daniel would expect. We'd had a slow quarter, and the formula was trailing revenue based. In 3 months, when our Brentwood contract payments came through, that number would be significantly higher. How long do I have to trigger it at the current price? Margaret was quiet for a moment. She was a careful woman. She chose her words with the same precision she applied to documents. The agreement doesn't specify a window, she said. You could trigger it now. I looked at her. I need to know one more thing, I said. If I trigger this and he can test it, how long does that take? Months. But the formula price is the formula price. It's in the contract he signed. Contesting the trigger is different from contesting the number. I nodded. Start the paperwork. She looked at me for a moment. Nathan, are you sure about the timing on this? Yes, I said. She started the paperwork. I came home that evening to find Sarah making dinner. She'd opened wine. The kitchen smelled like something she'd learned from a cooking class she'd taken the previous winter, and she was moving around the space with the ease of a person who had no reason to believe the ground had shifted. I set my bag down. I poured a glass of the wine she'd opened. How was your day? She asked. Long, I said. Good, though. Made some progress on the Brentwood timeline. She asked a question about Brentwood. I answered it. She told me about a client meeting she'd had, a residential project in Green Hills, some disagreement about plant selection. I listened and asked one follow-up question. We ate dinner at the table where I'd sat the night before with a glass of bourbon and the quiet understanding that everything had already changed. She was good at normal. I had always known that about her. She had a gift for the surface of things, for the maintenance of an atmosphere. Sitting across from her that evening, I understood for the first time that it was a skill she had been using on me for longer than I'd realized. I cleared the dishes. I told her I had some work to finish. I went to my office and closed the door. I sat at my desk and looked at the framed photo I kept there. Daniel and me at the Kellerman firm Christmas party, the year before we went out on our own. We were both laughing at something. I didn't remember what. I turned the photo face down on the desk. Then I opened my laptop and got back to work. Margaret filed the buyout trigger on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after I'd sat at the kitchen table and finished my drink. I was not in the office when it arrived. I had taken a personal day and driven out to the Murfreesboro Bridge project, the first one Daniel and I had worked on together, the one that had started everything. I stood on the shoulder of the road and looked at the structure for a long time. It was still standing. We had built it well. My phone buzzed. Margaret. "It's filed," she said. "He'll have it within the hour." "Thank you," I said. I drove back to Nashville. Daniel called 4 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. On the 5th call, I picked up. "Nathan." His voice was careful, controlled. I knew that voice. I'd heard it in 100 difficult client meetings. "I need to understand what's happening." "You're being bought out," I said. "Per the terms of the operating agreement. Section 7, paragraph 3. Margaret can walk your lawyer through the specifics." A pause. "This is about Sarah." I didn't answer. "Nathan, I need you to hear me out." "There's nothing to hear," I said. "This is a business matter. Have your lawyer call Margaret." I hung up. He came to the office the next morning. I wasn't there. I had moved my essential files and client contacts to a secure backup the week before, quietly, during lunch hours when the office was thin. I had also, on Margaret's advice, formally notified our 2 active municipal clients that the firm was undergoing a structural transition and that continuity of service was guaranteed. Both had responded with confirmation. They were my relationships. I had built them. Sarah called that evening. I let it go to voicemail. The message was long. I listened to it once, noted that it contained the word mistake 4 times and the word sorry twice, and deleted it. I served her with divorce papers the following Friday. She did not contest them. Margaret told me later that her lawyer had reviewed the timeline and advised her that contesting would produce outcomes she wouldn't prefer. I didn't ask what that meant specifically. I didn't need to. Daniel's lawyer contacted Margaret about the buyout. They negotiated for 3 weeks. The formula price held. He took it. Cole & Marsh Structural became Cole Structural on a Wednesday afternoon in March, with a new operating agreement, a new logo, and the 2 municipal contracts intact. I hired a junior partner, a woman named Teresa, who had worked for a firm in Memphis and who was, Margaret said, exactly the kind of talent I needed. She was right. I rented an apartment in Germantown while the divorce finalized. Small place, 2nd floor, a window that looked out over a street with old trees that were just starting to come back in the spring. I put my father's drafting table against the wall. He'd given it to me when I graduated, a heavy oak thing from the 1970s that he'd used his entire career. I set my coffee there in the mornings and looked out at the trees and thought about what I was building next. The answer, it turned out, was quite a lot. With the Brentwood contract payments landing and the firm operating leaner, the first year post-Daniel was the most profitable Cole Structural had ever had. Teresa brought 2 new clients from her Memphis network. I landed a hospital expansion contract in Chattanooga that we'd been pursuing for 18 months. By the end of the year, I had hired 2 more engineers and was looking at a second office. I also met someone. Her name was Jess. She was a contractor, commercial builds, the kind of work that put her on the same job sites I worked on, which was how we met. Standing in the structural bay of the Chattanooga Hospital project, disagreeing about a load-bearing wall she wanted to relocate. She was direct and technically precise and did not particularly care that I disagreed with her, which I found immediately interesting. We argued about the wall for 20 minutes. She was right about part of it. I was right about the rest. We compromised on a solution neither of us had started with. which she told me later was her standard measure of whether someone was worth working with. We had coffee once, at a site trailer, in paper cups, talking about the project. Then dinner, at a restaurant in Chattanooga's North Shore, talking about everything else. She had a daughter from a previous marriage, a clear sense of what she wanted from her days, and a way of looking at you when you were talking that made it plain she was actually listening and not just waiting for her turn. I told her about Sarah and Daniel on our fourth dinner together. She listened without performing sympathy. When I finished, she said, "You moved fast on the buyout." "I had a window," I said. "I used it." She looked at me for a moment. Most people don't think like that when they're hurt. "My father was an engineer," I said. "He taught me to measure before I fix." She considered that. "And are you fixed?" I thought about it honestly. "Getting there," I said. She nodded. "Fair enough." We drove back to Nashville together that night, which was 2 hours in the same car, and by the time we arrived, I understood that this was going to be something. I didn't say that. I just noted it the way I noted structural loads. Quietly, with precision, for reference. The divorce finalized 14 months after I'd sat at that kitchen table. I signed the papers in Margaret's office on a Thursday morning, shook her hand, and walked out into a Nashville spring that smelled like rain and cut grass and the particular freshness of a city that doesn't know what you've been through and doesn't owe you anything. I drove to the office. Teresa had coffee waiting. We had a site meeting at 10. I did not look back. 2 years after that Tuesday morning when Margaret filed the buyout trigger, I was in my office on a Saturday reviewing the Chattanooga expansion specs when my assistant texted to say there was a woman at the front desk asking for me. No appointment. She'd given her name as Sarah Cole. I told him to send her up. She looked different. Not dramatically. Sarah had always been careful about her appearance, and that hadn't changed. But something behind it was working harder. The ease I remembered, the particular comfort she'd always had in her own presence, was still there but thinner, like something that was being maintained by effort rather than nature. She sat in the chair across from my desk and looked around the office. The drafting table my father had given me, which I'd moved here from the apartment, the framed plans from the Murfreesboro Bridge on the wall, the view of the street below. "You've done well," she said. "Yes," I said. She said she needed to talk. I told her she could call Margaret if it was about the settlement. She said it wasn't. She said she and Daniel had ended things 8 months ago. She said she'd made a mistake and she'd known it for a long time and she'd needed to say that to me in person. I let her finish. Then I stood up and walked to the office door and opened it. She looked at me from the chair. Something moved in her face. Not surprise exactly. More like the recognition of a door that had been closed for long enough that reopening it was no longer possible. She stood. She gathered her bag. She walked to the door and stopped just in front of me, close enough that I could see exactly what 2 years had done to her certainty. "Is there anything?" she started. "No," I said. She nodded once. She walked out. I watched her go down the hallway and into the elevator. The doors closed. I stood there for a moment in the quiet of a Saturday morning, in an office I had built from the wreckage of something she and Daniel had tried to take, and I felt nothing in particular, which I had come to understand was exactly what moving on felt like when you'd done it correctly. I closed the office door and went back to the Chattanooga specs. That evening, Jess came over with her daughter, who was 7 and had strong opinions about what to order for dinner, which took 20 minutes to negotiate and ended in a compromise that satisfied nobody completely and everyone enough. We ate on the back porch while the evening came down over the neighborhood. Her daughter fell asleep on the couch before 8 o'clock. Jess looked at me over her wine glass. You're quiet tonight. Sarah came by the office today, I said. She was still for a moment. How was that? I thought about it. Finished, I said. She looked at me the way she had at that site trailer in Chattanooga. Actually listening, actually there. Then she nodded slowly and refilled her glass, and we sat in the quiet of the porch while the street settled into evening and her daughter slept inside. My father used to say that a good structure wasn't the one that never got tested. It was the one that held when it did. I'd been tested. I'd measured before I'd fixed. And what I'd built after, the firm, the work, this porch, this evening, was holding exactly the way good structures hold. Without drama, without announcement, just steady and standing, and mine.